From I Am Interchange, it's the Nomic Futures Podcast. Turtle Island. Before there were countries, before anyone called this land the United States, or Canada, or Mexico, this was Turtle Island. A continent of nations, overlapping territories, trade routes stretching farther than most modern highways, and relationships that lasted thousands of years. And today, that history is being carried forward by a room full of contemporary Indigenous leaders at Fort Mason, San Francisco's skyline in the backdrop, summit banners hanging over a conversation that reaches far beyond the city around it. This is the First Nations Economic Compact. I'm Tate Chamberlain. So, here's the moment. You're sitting in this conference room, a place that usually sounds like quarterly forecasts and budget projections. And suddenly, Chief Redman starts talking about an economic conversation older than any of that. One that predates the 1763 Royal Proclamation by King George III, predates colonial regulatory systems, predates the borders that now slice through nations whose trade routes once ran uninterrupted across this entire continent. And when he says it, you can feel the room shift. Long before federal governments measured growth by GDP, First Nations had their own economic indicators: ecological balance, kinship networks, sustainable yields, internation reciprocity agreements, systems the doctrine of discovery tried to erase, systems that survived genocide, forced relocations, and treaties. Some signed, some coerced, some never signed at all. And yet, the nations remain, the economies remain, the knowledge remains. Here, leaders talk about restoring ancient trade corridors, about resource and revenue sharing rooted not in federal cycles, but in ancestral law, and about building a bioeconomy, an economic framework centered on stewardship, continuity, and community resilience. Meanwhile, modern governments argue over tariffs and trade wars, and First Nations are putting forward something older and more future-ready, a sovereign economic compact drawn from traditional trade logic, but built for today's global market. As Chief Redman puts it, if someone doesn't want to deal with Canada or the United States, they can deal directly with First Nations. That line hangs in the air, because it isn't a request, it's a reminder. First Nations don't need permission to be sovereign. They need partners willing to recognize it. And suddenly this moment doesn't sound like policy talk. It sounds like nations dusting themselves off and reintroducing themselves. Not as stakeholders, not as interest groups, but as governments. This is what reconnection sounds like, what continuity sounds like, what a continent remembering itself sounds like. Stay with us. What has been your relationship to the First Nations?
My relationship is, as a Dakota person, we're part of the Oshetsi-Shikohi, which is the 7 council fires. I have my Indian name is Motohidika. I've been chief of our nation for 23 years now and grew up in our community and around our elders and very understanding, not an expert by no means of our cultural protocols, but that's why we have our elders there. I'm 56 years old. I'm a chief of our community, so I'm elected chief of our community. I represent our nation as Dakota people, and we've been on quite the journey right now, asserting our sovereignty in Canada. There's 9 Lakota bands in Canada, none treaty, and that's where we come from, in Saskatchewan.
Saskatchewan, geographically north of the United States.
Yeah, we're about 4 hours north of Minot, North Dakota. We're southern Saskatchewan, so we're right in central Canada, right above the North Dakota.
We're here to talk about the First Nations Economic Compact, or the Standing Buffalo Economic Corridor.
Yes.
Is it both?
Yes, it is, yeah. Right now, we're in litigation with the Department of Justice to assert our sovereignty. Out of the 74 bands in Saskatchewan, there's only 4 that are non-treaty. And we're one of the 4. And we're proudly to say that we haven't entered into treaties with Canada or the U.S. So when we talk about assertion of our sovereignty, we go back to 1763 to a military alliance with the British Crown. At the time, in 1763, we were given medals King George III medals. And those signified military alliance, cooperative federalism, the recognition of our governance, and more importantly, though, it was title to land. So this predates the Confederation of Canada, and it reaffirms our military alliance with the British Crown. 1763, the Spanish War of 1812, we were allies. And in 2019, we had this highest Justice Whelan made a ruling that our allyship with the British Crown is still intact. That was challenged. Tribunal was ruled in favor of Justice Whelan's decision, the recognition of our allyship. It was challenged again. Then it went to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court reaffirmed our allyship still intact with the British Crown.
And so with this, the separation between nations, some nations signed treaties and some didn't. They chose not to participate, and that kept them in a separate governance?
Yes. At the time when the treaties were being done, our ancestors were there. But at the time of Little Bighorn, and at the time when Custer got slaughtered, the 7th Cavalry, our ancestors were there. And they came into Canada, back into Canada. But a lot of people think that's the only time that we came into Canada. But what we've been saying is that we've been always as part of Canada. And we've got factual evidence that we put forward, the recognition of our allyship with the British Crown. We have Supreme Court decisions ruling. We had an apology from the Prime Minister last year to the Lakota people that we were woven into the history of Canada and that we were always looked down upon. But in reality, we were living within our traditional territories. And this apology was written by the Prime Minister of Canada. Now, as we go forward, we're applying the rights of our nation and the assertion of our sovereignty. We're operationalizing it through mechanisms like the Trade Corridor Initiative, and we've also got a piece of consultation framework that when the duty to consult was ruled 20-some years ago, it was a federal court ruling that First Nations need to be consulted in their traditional territories. But the courts never rule on the level of accommodation that's required. We're determining that through our consultation framework. And we're putting that forward to the industry and government and saying that this is our level of accommodation. We are in our territory, you're extracting resources, you've excluded us, you've oppressed our people through genocide and oppressive legislation, that now we're dusting ourselves off. We've got UNDRIP, the recognition now of the rights. Prior to that, a couple of years ago, we were not considered even a nation. Now, with the apology and the recognition of our inherent rights, it's no longer applied rights, it's admitted rights by Canada. So we're moving that forward, and on the Canadian side, that's what we're doing. On the American side, we have other nations that are part of the 7 Council Fires. Last week, we signed a MOU at Fort Peck in Montana to recognize our sovereignty on both sides of that border, to reinstill our traditional trade routes that are still there, and that we basically, with the wealth of the Indian people prior to European contact, was trade and barter. It's embedded in NAFTA and CUSMA under free trade agreements and with the 3 countries. There's legislation incorporated that required them to consult with the First Nations because it was our trade routes, our historical trade routes that created wealth prior to European contact. We're the first peoples of this land and our first on Mother Earth, and we have responsibilities to that. So that's what we're doing within our trade route, is ensuring that we're doing our responsibilities as far as environmental oversight, elder involvement, and of course there's mechanisms that are incorporating that within our traditional territories of resource revenue sharing, compact benefit agreements, and you name it. It's a process that we've been implementing for thousands of years. This is nothing new. So
pre-European culture, pre-borders, these nations existed throughout what is now Canada and the United States. And the economic trade since then has been disrupted. What does it look like now? And then we'll talk about your vision.
Right now, we're very oppressed people as Indian people. With genocide policies, the doctrine of discovery, they used that and applied that to the Indian people when they came into North America. And at that time, they used that Christianity in the doctrine to apply and create legislation to oppress the Indian people and force us into reserves, force us off our lands. They starved nations in the U.S. to sign treaties, force them to sign treaties. And right now what we're seeing is that we're sovereign nations, and especially with our community, we never signed treaty with Canada or the U.S. So we're operationalizing our sovereignty through mechanisms like the trade corridor. We're implementing that. It's not political rhetoric. We have our trade corridor operational. We've signed it. We have a number of industry players lining up to be part of that, not only from the state side, but also we're from other areas across the continent, within the world, coming to want to be part of that. So what we're doing is we're trying to instill the Indian people to believe in their sovereignty, take the wealth back that was the wealth of the Indian people with trade and barter, and apply our stewardship responsibility. Today, back then we were military allies, conflicts of war. Today, there's a trade war. It's a different type of war, but it's about money, power. And for us as Indigenous people, Indian people, there's more to it than that. But there's a way of our ancestors that defended the territories, and some of them made the ultimate sacrifice to protect what's rightfully theirs, the wealth of the Indian people, and to look after and preserve the lands for the next generation. It's important that we understand that, and that we believe in that. We believe in our prayer, and we believe in our ceremonies, and we believe in our traditional governance, which is tied to the land as First Peoples of this land.
What you just described is an economy that's more than just money, through trade and barter, and through, I think, probably just anyone who can put forward an effort towards making a community better. And I'm thinking also about the tariffs that are being implemented. Are they walking hand in hand together? Is the momentum from tariffs giving this more light into a possible future?
Oh, definitely. This is exactly, when we implemented this, we gave the government of Canada notice that we were implementing our corridor prior to even them announcing legislation on the projects of national interest. But when you look at it, how we are operationalizing the corridor is that we are going to have mechanisms within that corridor to identify and help facilitate tariff-free, tax-free tariffs trade within our traditional territories. One of the promises made by the British Crown in 1763 to our ancestors and to the other nations was that they would be allowed to trade in their traditional territory. Today, those are economic sanctions. The U.S. on the U.S. side recognized the Jay Treaty, the right of the nations to assert their sovereignty within trade and barter, tax-free, tariff-free. On the Canadian side, now, we have the legal standing to assert that sovereignty as a sovereign nation.
Walk me through the British Crown ruling and its relationship to the United States and Canada.
The British Crown ruling is on the Canadian side, and our brothers and sisters out east, the Mohawk. Last year, the province of Quebec tried to apply their taxation on their tobacco, transportation of their tobacco. Well, they are a non-treaty band. They're sovereign, and they took the same promises that were given by the British Crown in 1763, and they applied those to the courts. The courts ruled in their favor that the honor of the Crown has to be respected by Canada, because Canada is not a country. They're perceived as the representatives of the British Crown. Any laws that are passed in Canada have to get royal assent from the British Crown. What we're saying is you never got our royal assent as Indian people, as sovereign nations. So we're conducting ourselves as a nation.
Yeah, you never agreed.
Yes, exactly. We've been oppressed through legislation, through the doctrine of discovery and other things. So that's how we see it.
What types of people are participating? What kind of businesses, and then what nations?
Well, what we've looked at within our corridor is not only the transportation it's anything affecting the GDP and then the economic. It could be air projects, it could be energy, it could be produce. Anything that moves across that line is a recognition of our corridor. We're incorporating that into as part of that. And just recently now we've been asked to look at incorporating beyond the rights and the Indigenous people, but also recognizing other nations that are sovereign, that are fighting for that sovereignty, that are our genocide. So we're looking at those also to expand the corridor to be an international tool to be used to recognize and assert sovereignty within the trade corridors.
Is it only measured in GDP, or is there an environmental measurement that will go along with it?
Yeah, that's the other thing too. Like with us and with our environmental oversight, every project for industry that's going to be done in our territories, all territories of the Indian people, they need to ensure that there's environmental oversight and elder involvement, because our elders are our affirmation of our ceremonies and laws, our understanding to Mother Earth and Creator. Those are the things that we respect. It's called, there's military imperial parity, but there's also Creator's law. And that's one thing that as First Nation people, we acknowledge that Creator's law and the ancient relationships we have with the four-legged, the swimmers, the ones that crawl, and any living being that has that spirit as our connection. As two-legged, that's our responsibility, is to ensure that we protect any living being that has that spirit, the wind, sun, solar. Those are the things that would be coming through our corridor, including data sovereignty, including energy projects, produce. There's nothing stopping our First Nation people to have warehouses, to move product. Why is not the governments are not identifying that and recognizing our traditional trade corridor as a tariff-free, tax-free, because legally it's there. And that's what we're doing. We're operationalizing that movement of goods and services on both sides of the border, and inclusion of the First Nations protocols to be part of that solution that we're facing now. Because it's all about money, but everybody's forgetting about the responsibilities that we have. Come to work with the Indian people. We'll show you how it's done.
I understand the Canadian side and then the borderlessness of the sovereign nations coalition. The United States isn't obligated to the British Crown.
Yep.
Walk me through the United States side of this.
The United States have a number of organizations, and whatever happens in Canada happens in the U.S. So them too, they were oppressed, genocide, forced onto the reservations. Some of the nations were relocated because of the resources. And like I said, it was a theft of the wealth of the Indian people. That was our livelihood. So when they discovered gold, for example, in the Black Hills, they moved the Indian people out of there through force and genocide. They killed off the buffalo to starve the Indian people of their sustenance, to force them into signing treaties through starvation. So as Dakota Lakota people of the 7 council fires, our traditional territory is a mass area that goes into Canada and the U.S. We now have factual evidence through archaeological evidence. We have historical research. We have oral testimony. And that's all being recognized in Canada and is recognized in the U.S. But one of the big things that came out last week was we also have the support now of the United Nations. The rapporteur, Indigenous rapporteur, is supporting our initiative and moving forward, and we're going to be dialoguing with them on the areas that we see is still withholding and oppressing our people. So we have the support of the United Nations now coming in to help us with the application and recognition of our sovereignty.
Will the current administration in the United States work with you on that?
I think the current administration of the U.S., they look at, a lot of people generally look at Indian people as a dependent on the government. But it wasn't by our choice. There was forced dependency upon our people on social reform. Whenever our people were being successful in generating wealth, there was policies created to keep our people oppressed, and that opportunity was taken away from them. Now we talk about the trade corridor, our ancient trade routes, and there's an opportunity for the government to look at that and say, hey, if Canada doesn't want to deal with the trade tariffs and war and trade corridor, or the tariffs and sanctions, it's about money. But what I was saying was that give the Indian people infrastructure funding and work with us to recognize our traditional trade routes. We'll show you how it's done, how to generate wealth, but also incorporating the stewardship of the land and creating that. If you don't want to deal with Canada, come deal with the Indian people, because we have that right as rights holders, as the first people of this land. And we have the ability, the technology. Hohokia in the 1400s was the biggest trading center in North America. And it's factual evidence showing that there's artifacts that are strewn right across Canada, southern Canada, western Canada, U.S., that come directly from Hohokia. Like I said, we've been doing it for thousands of years to ensure that the sustainability and the wealth of our people was trade and barter. So that's why it's critical to tie to, we're drawing down a jurisdictional drawdown on our ancestral traditional governance through trade and barter.
And the United States side would rely on the treaties being upheld.
I think the United States need to embrace the support the First Nations, work with them, because as nations, we don't want to be dependent on our knees begging for crumbs for social programming and benefits getting cut. We want to generate wealth, and we should have every right to do that as landholders, rights holders. And through the trade corridor and through the mechanisms that are incorporated in that, there's opportunity to do that. We want to be self-sustaining nations. The recognition as nations at the national, international level to recognize our sovereignty. This is such a country that's free and prosperous for everybody else. Same with Canada. Canada, they're saying, the best country that people want to live in the world, except for the First Nation people.
Yeah.
We're still under that. And the U.S., same thing. So what we need to do is work with the nations. They need to come and work with us, and we'll help them, which traditionally, within the governance structures, they've taken already some of our traditional governance structures and applied it to the U.S. and how they structure their Senate and other forms, other committees. It's a duplicate of our traditional governance.
Will you give me an example of this happening right now?
We presented our case to the government, in Saskatchewan government and Canadian government. We're not asking for their approval. We're basing it and asserting it on our sovereignty position as a nation. Like I said, we never signed treaties. 4 things that Canada is saying that is non-negotiable: title, sovereignty, riparian rights, and oil and resources. And we said we agree to disagree because our nation is sovereign. So that's why we reached out to the United Nations to request their involvement. When 2 nations disagree, what happens? That's why we've taken it to the next level with the United Nations. And they've agreed to be part of a form of redress in our pursuit forward in our sovereignty. On the state side, I think that there again, there's benefit there for the states to come in and use our corridor to help move trade, goods, and services through our traditional ancient trade routes, revitalizing that. So we're operationalizing it now as we speak. We've given industry and the governments notice, and we're getting other nations signing on board, like Fort Peck, and we're hoping other nations to give them to believe in their sovereignty and to be part of a overarching process that's going to incorporate them and eventually help them get off that dependency system on the government, so that we're not socially dependent on them. We'll generate our own wealth from our own territories, from our own lands and our resources, and this shared title, that we have as collective.
You gave me the First Nations Economic Compact draft and a couple of the partners that you have on board. Is this all of them? 1, 2, 3.
Oh no, that's a copy of that's just a draft MOU that we signed with Fort Peck. Those are our council back home. There's myself as a chief, and I have 6 councillors. So that's just a draft of what the MOU was we signed with Fort Peck to give people an idea, the recognition of our sovereignty on both sides of that border.
Oh, I see. So this is a draft that you'll have with the different nations.
Yeah.
And then together you're going to put together the compact. And who will you deliver it to?
We're delivering it. We presented it to the COLT, Coalition of Large Tribes, which is a number of the nations in the U.S. and across Canada, from BC to the Blackfoot to the Mohawks. And like I said, they voted us as associate members of their organization after we presented. Because what we're doing is we're giving them an opportunity to show them how we can operationalize their sovereignty through the trade corridor, which was rightfully ours at the beginning. And we've depended on that for thousands of years, trade and barter, as Indian people. We're also presenting to the organization in 2 weeks. The National Congress of American Indians, NCAI, will be presenting in 2 weeks' time to present the corridor and to get them to buy in, to sign MOU. So no longer, we're going to be expanding it to be inclusive of other nations, not just the 7 council fires, the Ashaty-Chikoy, but other nations. Because what we're doing is we're trying to bring the rights-based arguments forward as a collective through guiding principles that as Indian people, the right that we have, our language, our ceremonies, our stewardship, these are the commonalities that we have as guiding principles. which are overarching and that connect us all, the ties to the land. And these are the things that we want to look at. MOU would be initial start, and then from there we can talk about the compact agreements that we're going to be signing and how we're going to be operationalizing that, within the framework. Yeah.
What questions aren't being asked?
To me, it's that the response from government. We've sent the copies of our framework. We sent a copy of our consultation framework. We sent copies of our trade corridor to Privy Council in Canada and to Prime Minister before he was even Prime Minister. We gave him a copy of our corridor initiative and our application, and we've asked for a $2 billion infrastructure fund. No response, no acknowledgement. So now we're going to have to look at sending registered mail and demanding a response, because they're still exercising that executive federalism approach, the whole colonial perspective on how the First Nations need to be told what to do. Those days are gone. But Canada is still trying to assert that executive federalism approach, and that's the thing. They're not responding, which is forcing litigation on our side. There's court cases now in Canada, the recognition of the Oral Meta Treaties and the Mohawks, the Montour case. And out east in BC, now you got land title recognition now, riparian rights being recognized. So there has to be a whole overhaul of the Indian Act and get it taken down, because that's just a piece of oppressive legislation that's forced upon the Indian people to keep them down and take the wealth of the Indian people. They're holding us down while they're digging in our wallets, is what they're doing. And there's no consultation. They're not coming to our people to talk about environmental oversight protections mechanisms on the people, the first people of these lands. So those are the things, I guess, it's government that are not responding. Which way I'm not looking for them to endorse what we're doing. We're just doing it. We're operationalizing our sovereignty and we're moving it forward. Yeah.
Is there anyone else resisting you?
At this point in time, I think people are trying to get their heads around what it is because of the social reform that's happening in the U.S. and in Canada with the trade war. I think people are not. It's front and center, of course, the main issues now in both countries. Is where is that going to go? It's shutting down economies. And like I said, we have answers. We can bring some solutions to the table for both countries if they would incorporate and embrace our First Nation corridor and the recognition and working with the rights of the Indian people.
What brings you hope?
Hope? I always have hope. We all need to have hope. Believe in our prayer. Believe in our identity, and that can take you a long way. When we manifest positive synergies, when we believe in that, to us as Indian people, those are our ceremonies. That is something that's critical. Belief system is our ceremonies. We actually believe in it. We believe in that prayer. We believe in that. And things happen for reasons. And we manifest that positive synergies that we create through that. And that's the whole idea of believing and having hope. Believe in yourself as a nation and as a rights holder. And we got to continue doing that. And it's very strong, powerful, and when we can do that.
This is I Am Interchange. I'm Tate Chamberlain with Chief Redman. Thank you very much for your time and for being here.
Thank you.
And that's the first of this 3-episode series. After the interview wrapped, what stayed with me wasn't any single line Chief Redman said, but the way his words reframed the whole idea of economic policy. Not as something emerging from think tanks or government halls, but from a continuity that never really broke, only got interrupted. When we stepped away from the microphones, there was this quiet clarity to the moment, the sense that what he was talking about wasn't theoretical, or symbolic, or aspirational. It was lived, ongoing, a reminder that sovereignty isn't something First Nations are reaching for. It's something they're standing in. Talking with him made it obvious. Once you look at economic futures through a lens thousands of years old, everything shifts. Trade, governance, the idea of a compact itself. These aren't new constructs. They're restorations, realignments, systems returning to their natural shape. And maybe that's the part that stays with you long after the conversation ends. The recognition that the future of Turtle Island's economy won't just be written by legislatures or agencies, but by nations that have been here since before any of those existed. We'll be back with more voices reshaping the economic future of Turtle Island, past, present, and the part that's unfolding right now. I'm Tate Chamberlain. Thanks for listening. Music for the Nomic Futures podcast is by Superman, a contemporary Indigenous artist from the Apsáalooke Nation, featuring the Northern Cree. Known for his innovative fusion of hip-hop and traditional Indigenous elements, Superman brings cultural heritage and modern storytelling to the soundtrack.
Following hers, I pray for you, pray for the sick and the poor, pray for the rich man who don't give to the Lord, and I pray for wisdom, and I pray for power, and I pray for be ready in the final hour, and I pray for those who keep judging ministry, and I pray for my friends and my enemies.
Hey everybody, thanks for listening to the podcast. If you enjoy it, please subscribe or leave us a rating. The Economic Futures Summit was brought to you by the University of California, Santa Cruz, Indigenous Engagement Institute, Gwen Bridge Consulting, Wolakota Lab, the Cleveland Foundation, Native Americans in Philanthropy, Salmon Returns, Nia Taro, Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, Margaret A. Cargill Philanthropies, Firelight, and Quaxala. Special thanks to Gwen Bridge, Julia Indivierno, Solomon Sear, Jacob Hune, Ruskar, and longtime I Am Interchange supporter, Whistlepig Korean. This episode was produced by Susan Karstensen and me, Tate Chamberlain. A shout out to our media and production team, Darko Sevilla, Amin Yarsu, and Jacob Desh. Remember, share airtime and don't ruin dinner.